The air in the Riverton High parking lot was thick with tension. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the cracked asphalt, the smell of warm pavement and distant fast food lingering in the air. A circle of students had formed, their voices hushed, their eyes wide with anticipation. It wasn't every day that you saw a fight brewing between someone like Travis "Tank" Reynolds and, of all people, Noah Carter. The king of the football team against the invisible nerd. Everyone thought they knew how this would end, but they didn't. Tank stood tall in the middle of the circle, his knuckles cracking as he rolled his shoulders back. He had been in plenty of fights before. Dominance was something he enforced naturally, his presence alone enough to make people step aside. He had built a reputation on strength, intimidation, and raw physical power. Noah was an easy target. Too skinny, too quiet, too beneath notice. At least he had been. Until now, Noah wasn't cowering. He wasn't trembling. He wasn't even blinking. His stance was steady, his fists relaxed at his sides. But there was something in his eyes, something Tank didn't recognize. Not fear, not anger, just an unwavering, unshakable certainty. And then Noah spoke, then hit me. The crowd sucked in a collective breath. A challenge like that wasn't just unexpected, it was insanity. Tank narrowed his eyes, confusion flickering across his face before turning into a smirk. "You got a death." "Wish, Carter." Noah didn't answer. He just stood there, waiting. Tank let out a short, sharp laugh. This was going to be over in seconds. He pulled back his fist, muscles coiling, ready to send Noah crumpling to the ground with a single clean shot. And then he swung. But Noah wasn't there anymore. In a blur of movement, Noah shifted, his body twisting just enough to let the punch sail past him, Tank's fist slicing through empty air. Before he could recover, Noah's hand shot out, gripping Tank's wrist in a firm, practiced motion, a sharp twist, a fluid, precise motion that sent pain lancing up Tank's arm. His balance faltered, the ground beneath him suddenly unstable. And then, before he could even process what was happening, his feet left the asphalt. The impact was sudden, hard, a brutal meeting between his back and the unforgiving pavement. The world spun as Tank gasped, his lungs momentarily refusing to work. The murmurs around him turned into stunned silence. No one had expected this. Noah stood over him, breathing evenly, his hands still relaxed. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't even look triumphant. Instead, there was something far worse. Disappointment. Tank blinked up at him, his head still spinning. His body screamed at him to get up, to retaliate, to prove somehow that this hadn't just happened. But his limbs refused to move. Noah exhaled through his nose, the slightest shake of his head betraying his thoughts. He could finish this. Tank knew that much. A knee to the ribs, a fist to the face. 1,000 things that could have turned the tide of humiliation into full-blown defeat. But Noah didn't move. He just looked at him. "You don't have to be like this," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Tank felt something foreign creep up his spine. Not rage, not humiliation. Doubt. Somewhere in the back of his mind, something splintered. A memory. A voice from the past, sharp and angry. Never let them see weakness. And yet here he was, weak, on the ground, beaten by someone he had barely acknowledged before this moment. The silence around them stretched, thick and suffocating. Then the spell broke. Someone coughed. Another person whispered something under their breath. The tension shifted, cracked, and finally shattered into scattered murmurs. Noah didn't wait for a reaction. He turned and walked away, the crowd parting for him without a word. Tank remained where he was, staring up at the sky, his body aching, but his pride shattered far. Worse, everything had changed. and for the first time in his life, he had no idea what to do about it. Riverton High had always been a place of unwritten rules. There were those who ruled and those who followed. The football team sat at the top, an unchallenged dynasty of strength and arrogance, and at the very peak of that pyramid was Travis, Tank Reynolds. With his towering frame, sculpted from years of weight training and an endless supply of raw aggression, he was more than just a player. He was a legend in the making. His dominance wasn't just felt on the field, it was in the hallways, the lunchroom, the very air of the school. People moved aside when he walked past, careful not to get in his way. And then there was Noah Carter. Noah had spent years perfecting the art of invisibility. He moved through the school like a ghost, head down, hands in his pockets, always keeping to the edges where he could disappear. It wasn't that he was weak. He had just learned that drawing attention meant inviting problems. He had seen what happened to those who stepped out of line, the ridicule, the shoves in the hallway, the laughter that followed them wherever they went. Noah had decided long ago that it was easier to exist in silence than to risk being noticed. But being invisible had its consequences. It made him an easy target. It had started small, as it always did. A comment here, a shove there. Tank would pass by him in the hallway and knock his books from his hands, laughing as Noah bent down to pick them up. Sometimes it was a hard slap. To the back of the head as he walked past, a muttered, "Stay awake, Carter," as if Noah was some kind of joke. It was never enough to justify fighting back, just enough to remind everyone who was in charge. The worst had been the day in the cafeteria. Noah had been reading during lunch, sitting alone at his usual table in the corner, absorbed in the pages of a book that had, for a brief moment, allowed him to escape. Then suddenly, it was gone, yanked from his hands. "Look at this," Tank had said, holding the book up for the entire cafeteria to see. "Carter's got himself some reading material. Bet it's something real exciting. Maybe a self-help guide for losers." The laughter had been immediate, sharp and cutting. Noah had sat frozen, his fists clenched under the table, every nerve in. His body screaming at him to stand up, to say something, but he didn't. He just watched as Tank flipped through the pages carelessly before finally dropping the book onto the floor with a smirk. Oops. Then he stepped on it. Something inside Noah had cracked at that moment. A heat had risen in his chest, something raw and unfamiliar. He had looked up at Tank, his usual silence replaced by something colder, something unshakable. "Pick it up," he had said. The cafeteria had gone silent. Tank had blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Then the smirk had returned. "What was that?" Noah had slowly pushed back his chair, standing to his full height, which, compared to Tank, wasn't much, but for the first time, he wasn't hunched over. He wasn't trying to disappear. "Pick it up," he had repeated, his voice steady. For a brief second, something had passed between them, a shift. The laughter around them had died down, replaced with something else. Curiosity, maybe. Confusion. This wasn't the reaction anyone had expected. Noah wasn't supposed to talk back. He was supposed to sit down and take it, to pretend it didn't matter. But Noah wasn't pretending anymore. Tank had chuckled, shaking his head. "You've got some nerve, Carter." Then he had walked away, leaving. The book crumpled and dirty on the floor. And from that moment, everything had changed. Tank had started watching him differently after that. The usual shoves in the hallway became something more calculated. The jokes turned into direct challenges. Noah could feel the weight of his stare whenever they crossed paths, an unspoken tension growing between them like a storm waiting to break. The others noticed too. The rest of the football team, the students who had once ignored Noah entirely, began paying attention. Whispers followed him through the halls. "Did you see what Carter did? Is he actually standing up to Tank?" This won't end well for him. Noah wasn't sure if it was fear or adrenaline that kept him moving forward, but he knew one thing. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. And then, one afternoon, it happened. Tank had been waiting for him outside the school, leaning against the side of his truck with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Noah had known what was coming the moment he stepped into the parking lot. There were too many people lingering nearby, pretending not to be watching. When Tank finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost amused. Parking lot. After school. Noah had only hesitated for a second before responding. I hope you're ready. And with that, the challenge had been set. Noah knew he wasn't the same person he had been a few months ago. He had changed. And by the end of this, Tank was going to realize that too. Noah slammed the door behind him, his backpack dropping to the floor with a dull thud. His pulse was still hammering, his thoughts a chaotic storm replaying the scene in the parking lot over and over again. He had done it. He had challenged Tank. The moment the words left his mouth, he had felt something shift, not just in the air around him, but inside him. It was as if, for the first time in his life, he had grabbed the reins instead of letting them be yanked from his hands. But now, standing in the quiet of his own home, reality pressed in. He wasn't strong enough. Not yet. His mother's voice drifted from the kitchen, asking if he was home, but he barely registered it. He walked straight past, heading for the garage. The air was thick with the scent of oil and metal, the faint remnants of cigarette smoke, lingering in the wood of the workbench. And sitting there, sharpening a knife with slow, methodical strokes, was Jack. Jack Carter had never been the kind of man who wasted words. He was built like a soldier, because he had been one. Broad shoulders, weathered hands, and a gaze that could strip you down to the bone. He wasn't the warm, storytelling uncle that movies painted. He was sharp edges and quiet lessons. The kind of man who had seen the worst of people and never expected anything else. He didn't look up when Noah entered, just kept sharpening. Rough day. Noah hesitated, his fists clenching at his sides. Jack had always been able to read him like an open book, but this time he didn't feel like talking around it. I need to learn how to fight. The blade paused. Jack's eyes flicked, up cold and unreadable. That's so? Noah nodded, his breath steady even as his stomach tightened. Jack set the knife down, leaning back in his chair. And why's that? Noah hesitated. There was a million ways to answer that question. Revenge, pride, fear. But he knew none of those would be good enough for Jack, so he told the truth. I'm tired of being weak. Jack watched him for a long moment. Then, with a sigh, he pushed himself to his feet, stretching out his back before walking toward the far side of the garage. He shifted a stack of boxes, revealing a rolled-up mat and an old, battered punching bag hanging from the ceiling. He gestured toward it with a nod, then hit it. Noah didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and threw a punch. It was awkward, clumsy, all wrist and no power. The bag barely moved. Jack scoffed. That was embarrassing. Noah clenched his jaw, shaking out his hand. I wasn't ready. Tank's not gonna wait for you to be ready, Jack said, stepping closer. You want to stop being weak? First, you got to learn what strength actually is. And so it began. The first thing Jack drilled into him was that fighting wasn't about anger. It wasn't about strength either, not in the way most people thought. It was about control, timing, precision. He made Noah stand with his feet planted, learning how to balance his weight. He made him throw punches for hours, correcting his form each time he slipped. But more than that, he made him think. You're not here to be the strongest guy in the room, Jack told him between sets. You're here to make sure you never have to fight unless you choose to. It was frustrating. The first week was nothing but footwork, dodging, understanding. Where to move and when. Jack barely let him touch the punching bag. Every time Noah complained, Jack just grunted, muttering something about patience. But patience wasn't something Noah had anymore. One night, after a particularly brutal session, he dropped onto the floor, wiping sweat from his forehead. Jack leaned against the workbench, watching him with an expression that wasn't quite approval, but wasn't dismissal either. "You ever wonder why guys like Tank do what they do?" Jack asked. Noah exhaled, staring at the ceiling. "Because they can," Jack shook his head. "No, it's because they're scared." Noah frowned, rolling onto his elbows. "Tank isn't scared of anything." Jack let out a short laugh. "Kid, you'd be surprised. People like that, they've spent their whole lives proving something. To their dads, their coaches, their friends, hell, to themselves. If they stop being the biggest, baddest thing in the room, they don't know who they are anymore. That kind of fear, that's dangerous." Noah mulled over that, letting the words sink in. He had spent so long seeing Tank as an unstoppable force, as something towering over him like an immovable wall. But for the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, Tank was fighting something invisible too. Still, it didn't change the fact that in a few days they were going to meet in that parking lot. And when that moment came, Noah wasn't going to be the one lying on the ground. Noah walked through the halls of Riverton High with a weight pressing against his chest, but it wasn't fear, it wasn't dread. It was something different, something sharp, like anticipation coiled beneath his skin, ready to spring. The fight was coming. It was inevitable, written into the very fabric of this place, stitched between the lockers and the cafeteria tables, and the whispers that followed him down every hallway. Everyone was waiting, watching, measuring him with their eyes as if trying to decide whether he was a fool or something else entirely. Tank had noticed too. It was in the way he looked at Noah now, less like a target and more like a problem that needed solving. He wasn't used to problems. He was used to challenges that folded, people who bent before they could even be broken. But Noah wasn't bending. He wasn't playing his part. And that had changed everything. The moment finally came between classes, just as Noah had known it would. The hallway was packed, the air thick with the scent of cheap cologne and anticipation. Noah was at his locker, retrieving a book, when the familiar presence loomed beside him, casting a shadow over the metal doors. He didn't turn immediately. He could feel Tank's presence like a storm rolling in, could hear the subtle shift of movement as people stepped back, waiting for the inevitable. "You're walking different, Carter," Tank said, voice low but carrying. Noah finally turned, meeting, his gaze without hesitation. "Maybe you're just seeing me differently." For a second there was silence. A slow, creeping grin spread across Tank's face, but there was no humor in it. "You really think this ends any other way?" Noah let the question settle. He could hear the amusement in Tank's voice, the absolute certainty in the way he stood, the way he held himself like gravity bent around him. But what Tank didn't understand, what no one understood, was that Noah wasn't here to win or lose. He was here to stand. "You don't scare me anymore," Noah said. And for the first time, he saw something flicker in Tank's eyes, something uncertain, and that was when the challenge was set in stone. "Parking lot. After school," Tank said, stepping back, voice carrying across the hall. Noah didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. "I'll be there." The reaction was immediate, the murmurs, the exchanged looks, the quiet buzz that ran through the students like an electric current. Tank had just done something he never did. He had made it official. It wasn't just between them anymore. It was a spectacle. By the time the final bell rang, Noah could feel the tension thick in the air. People weren't leaving school. They were heading to the parking lot, moving like a wave, eager for the violence, for the show. Noah's hands were steady as he packed his bag, his heartbeat even. He had spent weeks preparing for this, hours training under Jack's relentless eye. and now it was time to see if it meant anything. When he stepped outside, the crowd was already. Forming Tank was waiting, standing near his truck, arms crossed over his chest, exuding the same unshakable confidence he always had. His teammates were near him, laughing, but there was an edge to the way they glanced at Noah, a hesitation they hadn't had before. Noah didn't stop walking. He stepped into the space left for him, right in the center of everything, and dropped his bag onto the pavement. The air was still, thick with expectation. Tank cracked his knuckles. "You sure you want to do this?" Noah rolled his shoulders, shaking out his hands. "Yeah, I am." Tank exhaled almost like he was disappointed. Then he moved. It was fast. It was brutal. The first punch came straight for Noah's face, a heavy, crushing thing meant to end this in one hit. But Noah wasn't there. He pivoted, just enough to let the fist pass harmlessly by his cheek, feeling the force of it rush past like wind. And then, before Tank could even register the miss, Noah moved. His hands shot out, a sharp, controlled motion, catching Tank's wrist, twisting. Not enough to break, not enough to maim, just enough to redirect, just enough to shift the power. Tank stumbled, just slightly, just for a moment, but it was enough. The crowd gasped. Noah let go and stepped back, watching as Tank caught himself, straightened and turned with something new in his expression, something just shy of respect. This wasn't going to be the fight he expected. Noah wasn't running, he wasn't breaking. For the first time, Tank was going to have to fight someone who had already decided they weren't afraid. Tank moved again, faster this time. He wasn't holding back anymore. The hesitation was gone, replaced with sheer, unfiltered aggression. His footwork was sharp, his body coiled like a spring, and when he lunged, he did it with the weight of a freight train. Noah barely had time to react. The punch came in low, aimed for his ribs, a brutal shot meant to break him from the inside out. But Noah had spent weeks training for this. He twisted at the last second, Tank's fist grazing his side instead of finding its mark. And before the bigger boy could recover, Noah moved. He didn't go for the knockout. That wasn't the plan. Instead, he used Tank's own momentum against him, catching his wrist again, guiding it past him, just enough to throw him off balance. For a split second, Tank staggered. It was small, barely noticeable, but Noah saw it. He saw the moment of uncertainty flash across Tank's face, the fraction of a second where the confidence wavered. And for the first time, Noah knew he wasn't just surviving this fight. He was controlling it. But Tank wasn't done, not even close. He regained his footing in an instant, adjusting, recalibrating. He wasn't just some dumb jock who relied on brute strength. He was an athlete, a competitor, and he was used to adapting. This time, he didn't charge recklessly. He measured Noah, eyes narrowing, muscles tightening like a predator, studying its prey. And then, with terrifying speed, he closed the gap. Noah barely had time to register the movement before Tank's knee came up fast and unforgiving. It slammed into his stomach, the force of it knocking the wind from his lungs. Pain exploded through his torso, white-hot and sharp, and for a second, everything blurred. His body instinctively wanted to fold, to crumple under the impact, but he gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay on his feet. He staggered back, gasping for air, but he didn't fall. The crowd erupted. For them, this was exactly what they had come to see. The raw violence, the clash of two forces, the unpredictability of it all. But for Noah, this wasn't a spectacle. This was about proving something, to himself, to Tank, to everyone. Tank wiped sweat from his brow, rolling his shoulders. "You done?" Noah inhaled deeply, steadying himself. The pain was still there, but he pushed past it. He wasn't done. He raised his hands again. Not even close. Tank exhaled sharply, shaking his head, almost like he was impressed. And then he attacked again. Noah was ready this time. He ducked under the first punch, feeling it slice through the air inches from his face. He pivoted, moving with precision, his training kicking in. He wasn't stronger, he wasn't faster, but he was thinking, analyzing, using every opening Tank gave him. And when he saw his chance, he took it. Tank overextended. Just slightly. Just enough. Noah didn't hesitate. He shifted inside Tank's reach, using the bigger boy's momentum against him. His elbow snapped up, fast and sharp, slamming into Tank's ribs. The impact was solid, sending a shudder through Tank's frame, but Noah didn't stop there. He followed through, twisting his body, sweeping Tank's leg out from under him in one fluid motion. For the second time, Tank hit the ground. The world seemed to hold its breath. Tank lay there for a moment, his chest rising and falling, his hands pressing against the pavement as he pushed himself up. Noah took a step back, hands still raised, waiting. But Tank didn't get up to fight. He just sat there, breathing heavily, looking up at Noah with something different in his expression. Not anger, not humiliation, just realization. Noah let his arms drop slightly. He didn't need to throw another punch. He didn't need to prove anything else. He stepped forward and, to the shock of everyone watching, extended a hand. Tank stared at it. The world seemed to shrink down to that single moment, that single choice. Then slowly, he reached out and took it. Noah pulled him up, and just like that, the fight was over. The next morning, Riverton High felt different. The usual chaos of slamming lockers and shouted conversations still filled the halls, but there was an undercurrent of something else. A shift, a ripple through the school's ecosystem. Eyes followed Noah as he walked, but it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't pity, it wasn't dismissal. It was something closer to curiosity, maybe even respect. Tank hadn't spoken to him since the fight. Not in words, anyway. But Noah could feel it, something unspoken settling between them, heavy like a secret. In the cafeteria, the usual hierarchy was still intact, but the edges had frayed. Tank sat with his team, but he wasn't laughing. He wasn't holding court like he always did. Instead, he was quiet, staring down at his tray as his teammates threw glances his way, waiting for him to explain how the unthinkable had happened. "You gonna pretend that didn't happen?" one of them finally said, nudging Tank's arm with his elbow. "You let Carter show you up, man." Tank's jaw clenched. The tension in his shoulders was obvious, but he didn't lash out, didn't defend himself. He just kept his gaze lowered, pushing his food around with his fork. Noah didn't expect an apology. He wasn't stupid. Tank wasn't the kind of guy who said sorry, not with words, but something told him that what had happened in that parking lot wasn't over yet. After school, it became obvious. Noah was pulling his books from his locker when he felt it, the familiar, looming presence behind him. He turned, already knowing who it was before he even saw the face. Tank stood there, hands in his pockets, shifting his weight like he wasn't entirely sure what he was supposed to do. For the first time, he wasn't radiating confidence. He wasn't towering over Noah like some immovable force. He was just standing there, thinking. "You hit harder than you look," Tank finally said, voice rough. Noah blinked, thrown by the comment. He had expected a confrontation, more chest beating, another reminder that despite what had happened, Tank was still in charge. But instead, this. "Yeah, well," Noah said, sliding his locker shut. "You're not as invincible as you think." Tank let out a sharp breath, something between a chuckle and a sigh. Guess not. For a moment they stood there, the hallway emptying around them as students rushed to their cars, to buses, to the rest of their lives. Noah didn't know what this was, this weird, quiet tension hanging between them. Then, after a long pause, Tank spoke again. "I need to learn." Noah frowned. "Learn what?" Tank hesitated. The words didn't come easy, like they had to be ripped out of him. "How to fight like you." Noah stared at him, trying to process what he was hearing. Tank was asking him. "For help. You've been training," Tank continued, crossing his arms. "That wasn't just luck. You knew what you were doing." Noah stayed silent, studying him. Tank looked uncomfortable, like he hated every second of this conversation, but had no choice but to see it through. Finally, Noah exhaled, shaking his head. "I didn't do it to fight. I did it so I didn't have to fight." Tank's jaw tightened. "I don't want to be that guy anymore." The honesty in his voice caught Noah off guard. He had expected resistance, defiance, maybe even denial. But this was real. Noah thought about Jack, about the brutal lessons in the garage, about the sweat and bruises and the endless drills that had turned him into someone who could stand his ground. He thought about the way Jack had looked at him that first night and known, really known, what he needed. Now Noah was looking at Tank and seeing the same thing. "You serious about this?" Noah asked. Tank nodded. Noah sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Then be at my place tomorrow." Tank didn't thank him, didn't smile. He just gave a single, slow nod before turning and walking away. Noah watched him go, realizing something he hadn't before. The fight hadn't been the end. It had been the beginning. The next evening, just as the last streaks of daylight faded into the deep blue of night, Tank stood outside Noah's house. The garage door was already open, the dim light inside casting long shadows against the pavement. The space smelled like oil, sweat, and something metallic, like the ghosts of every fight that had ever happened there, still lingered in the air. Noah stood in the center of it, hands wrapped in tape, sweat already darkening his shirt. Jack was nowhere in sight, but Tank could feel his presence in the details, the heavy bag hanging from the ceiling, the scuffed-up mats on the floor, the quiet hum of discipline in every corner of the room. Tank hesitated. This wasn't his world. He was used to weight rooms, football drills, the roar of the crowd when he bulldozed through a defensive line. Here there was no audience, no scoreboard, just him, Noah, and the work. "You gonna stand there all night or are you coming in?" Noah's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, like he wasn't entirely convinced Tank would go through. With this, Tank stepped forward, rolling his shoulders, trying to shake the awkwardness from his body. "Let's get this over with." Noah didn't respond. He just tossed a roll of tape to Tank. "Wrap your hands." Tank caught it, staring at it for a second. "I know how to throw a punch." "You know how to throw hard punches," Noah corrected. "Doesn't mean you know how to fight." Tank let out a sharp breath, irritated, but knowing he couldn't argue. He wrapped his hands, mimicking what Noah had done, then looked up, waiting. "Footwork first," Noah said. Tank blinked. "Seriously?" Noah nodded. "If you can't control where you're standing, you can't control the fight." Tank scoffed, but he followed Noah's instructions. The next 20 minutes were frustrating. Noah had him moving, shifting his weight, learning how to stay balanced, even when pressure came from the sides. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't exciting. It felt like a waste of time. "You're just making me dance around," Tank grumbled. Noah gave him a look. "And right now, you dance like a refrigerator." Tank gritted his teeth, but he didn't argue. He just kept moving. Eventually, Noah let him hit something. The first time Tank swung at the bag, it felt good, solid, powerful, the way it always did. The impact sent a dull, satisfying shock through his arm. But Noah shook his head. "Too much arm," he said. "You're throwing, not striking." Tank frowned. "What's the difference?" Noah stepped forward, demonstrating, throwing a clean, sharp punch. The bag barely swung, but Tank could see the force ripple through it. He tried again, this time focusing on his stance, on his core. When the impact came, it felt different, less wild, more controlled. Noah nodded. "Better." The garage was quiet except for the rhythmic sound of fists hitting the bag, the steady inhale and exhale of breath. Tank was used to training sessions being loud, coaches barking orders, teammates shouting encouragement. Here, the silence was thick, pressing against him, making him aware of every motion, every mistake. He liked it. When Noah finally called for a break, Tank was drenched in sweat. He leaned against the workbench, catching his breath. Noah sat on the floor, stretching out his legs. "You're not bad," Noah admitted. Tank smirked. Was that a compliment? Noah shrugged. "Don't get used to it." For a while, they just sat there, the hum of the night settling around them. Tank glanced around the garage, taking in the details. He'd spent years thinking Noah was just some quiet, bookish nobody. But this place, it told a different story. It spoke of discipline, of hours spent honing something most people would never see. Finally, Tank exhaled, shaking his head. "You ever wonder why I was such an asshole to you?" Noah didn't answer right away. He stretched his arms over his head, considering. "I used to. Not anymore." Tank frowned. "Why not?" Noah met his gaze. "Because I think you're starting to wonder." "The same thing." Tank stared at him for a second, then looked away. Noah didn't push. The work would continue tomorrow. Tank showed up again the next day, and the day after that, and the one after that. Each evening after practice, after the weight room, after the world had already taken its toll on him, he came to Noah's garage. The training was brutal, not in the way he was used to. Not just endless drills meant to build strength, but something more precise, more unforgiving. Footwork, evasion, control, things that made him feel slow, heavy, uncoordinated, even though he was the strongest guy in the room. Noah never went easy on him. If Tank threw a punch wrong, Noah corrected him. If his stance was sloppy, Noah pointed it out. There were no compliments, no hand-holding, just work. Tank found himself craving it. The fights at school had stopped. Not because Tank had suddenly turned into a saint, but because something had shifted. People still moved when he walked down the hallway, but it wasn't out of fear. It was different. It was something he hadn't felt before, something that wasn't just dominance, respect. And for the first time, he realized how hollow all the years before had been. One night, after an especially grueling session, he sat on the floor of the garage, chest heaving, sweat dripping from his forehead. Noah tossed him a bottle of water and leaned against the workbench, stretching out his arms. "You're still fighting like someone who thinks the world is out to get him," Noah said, watching him. Tank took a long swig of water, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Maybe it is," Noah shook his head. "No. You just don't know what to do when it's not." Tank's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue, because the truth was, Noah wasn't wrong. For as long as he could remember, he had been told he had to be the strongest, the fastest, the best. His father had made sure of that. Weakness wasn't an option. He had been raised to believe that the world was a war, and if he didn't come out swinging, he'd end up on the ground. He had learned to hit first, to make sure people feared him enough that they'd never get close enough to hurt him. And yet, here he was, in a garage with the one guy he had spent years trying to tear down, learning how to rebuild himself. He let out a breath, staring at the ceiling. "When I was a kid, my dad used to say that the only way to survive was to be the one who hit harder." Noah didn't react right away. He just rolled his shoulders, considering. "Sounds exhausting." Tank let out a short, dry laugh. "Yeah, it is." Noah was quiet for a long moment. Then finally he said, "You don't have to be that guy anymore." Tank exhaled, staring down at his hands. He wasn't sure if he knew how to be anything else. But for the first time, he wanted to find out. So he kept showing up, kept training, kept fighting. Not the world this time, not the people who used to fear him. Just himself. The night before the big game, Tank stood in front of the mirror in his bedroom, staring at his own reflection. His knuckles were raw from training, his muscles ached in ways that weightlifting never touched. But it wasn't just the physical. Changes that unsettled him. It was the way he felt, lighter, sharper, like he wasn't carrying the same weight he always had. But then, in the silence, came the familiar voice in the back of his mind, the one that sounded too much like his father. "You think this changes anything?" Tank clenched his jaw, pushing the thought away. It didn't matter. Not now. The game was everything. The semi-finals, the biggest match of the season. Colleges were watching. His coach had been hammering the same point all week. This is where legends are made. But for the first time, Tank wasn't sure he cared about being a legend. He had spent his whole life chasing that, proving he was the best, making sure no one ever doubted who was in charge. Now, after months of training with Noah, of seeing things from a different angle, it all felt different. The stadium lights were blinding, the roar of the crowd vibrating through his bones as he stood on the field. The energy was intoxicating, but beneath it was something else, something quieter. Focus. The whistle blew and the game started. Everything moved fast, but Tank was used to that. His body reacted on instinct, bulldozing through the defense, cutting through bodies like they were nothing. But then, near the end of the second quarter, it happened. A freshman from the opposing team, barely more than a kid, got tackled hard. Too hard. He hit the ground wrong, his body folding, and for a second he didn't move. The moment stretched. Tank's teammates started laughing, nudging each other, making jokes, but Tank didn't. He was watching the kid, the way he clutched. At his ribs, the way his breathing was shallow, quick. The old Tank wouldn't have cared. He would have stepped over him, kept walking. But now, something in his gut twisted. Before he even realized what he was doing, he reached down and offered the kid a hand. Silence. His teammates stared. The other team hesitated. Tank ignored them. The kid looked up, his eyes wide, confused. Then slowly he took Tank's hand. In the stands, Noah was watching. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The game continued, and they won. But for the first time, winning wasn't the thing that mattered most to Tank. After the match, as he walked off the field, his teammates still hyped from the victory, his coach clapping him on the shoulder, Tank spotted Noah near the exit. He was leaning against the fence, arms crossed, an unreadable expression on his face. Tank walked over, rolling his shoulders. "So? You see that?" Noah smirked. "Yeah, you finally got it." Tank exhaled, shaking his head. "Took me long enough?" Noah nodded. "Better late than never." Tank had spent his whole life thinking strength was about dominance, about proving you were the biggest, the strongest, the one no one could touch. But standing there, bruised and exhausted, he realized something else. Strength wasn't about hitting harder. It was about knowing when not to. Months passed. The air grew colder, the weight of the school year pressing heavier on everyone's shoulders. The fight in the parking lot had become a legend, whispered in the halls like a myth. But Noah and Tank had moved beyond it. They didn't talk about it. They didn't need to. Something had settled between them that was bigger than words. Something understood in the way Tank no longer carried himself like he had something to prove, and the way Noah didn't walk through the halls like he was bracing for a hit that never came. Tank still ruled the football field, still carried the weight of expectations from coaches, scouts, and his father. But it didn't own him the way it used to. He played because he wanted to, not because he needed to prove his worth. And when he walked off the field after every game, he wasn't looking for approval from his teammates or the crowd. He was looking for Noah. It wasn't about validation. It was about knowing someone out there saw him. Not just the athlete, not just the enforcer, but him. Noah, on the other hand, had found something new in himself. He still preferred books to crowds, still. Liked the quiet over the noise, but he no longer moved through school trying to disappear. He existed in a way he hadn't before. He still trained, still spent hours in the garage with Jack, refining his movements, his control, but it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about choice. He had spent years feeling powerless, but now he understood that power had nothing to do with fists. It was in standing tall, in knowing who you were. The first time Tank showed up at the garage unannounced, Noah had raised an eyebrow, not bothering to hide his smirk. "You lost?" Tank scoffed, stepping inside. arms crossed. Don't flatter yourself. Noah had just shrugged, tossing him a roll of tape, and so it became routine. Tank didn't need to be there. The football team had its own gym, its own coaches, its own endless supply of drills. But he kept showing up, kept training, not because he had something to prove, because he liked it, because it made him better, because for the first time he wasn't learning how to fight. He was learning how to be. One night, after a particularly brutal session, they sat on the floor of the garage, chest heaving, sweat dripping onto the mats. The air smelled like dust and metal, and outside the night stretched silent and endless. Tank rolled his shoulders, wincing. "Jack ever let up on you?" Noah smirked, shaking his head. "Not once," Tank huffed, stretching out his arms. "Figured." A comfortable silence settled between them. Tank let his head fall back against the wall, staring at the ceiling. He didn't know when it had happened, when the anger, the pressure, the need to dominate had finally loosened its grip on him. But it had. And he was still here. Still standing. He let out a breath. "I used to think strength meant making people afraid of me." Noah didn't respond right away. Then quietly he said, "And now?" Tank exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "Now I think strength is knowing you don't have to be." Noah looked at him, and for the first time since they had met, Tank felt like the weight of everything, his past, his reputation, the expectations that had shaped him, didn't matter. He was just himself. Noah nodded. "Took you long enough." Tank chuckled. "Yeah, but I got there." And in the quiet of the garage, between the worn-out mats and the battered punching bag, between two people who had once stood on opposite sides of a battlefield, something solidified, not rivalry, not dominance, respect, maybe, even friendship.
If you enjoyed the story and want to see more content like this, support the channel by subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications.